Hello, and welcome to the Creamsicle Chronicle podcast. I am your host, JT Olson, and with me is nobody. Normal co host Garrett Ballard off tonight, trying to find some balance in that work life mix. Garrett will be back next week, regularly scheduled time. But for now, it is me at Icewater Olson on Twitter. Give me a follow if you're interested in Bucks content. Give us a follow. Find all our written work at Bucks Report. So, we were off last week. We took a hiatus. We were guests on another podcast. Now we are back. A little bit to talk about before we talk about the Bucks 53-man roster. The Buccaneers had their final preseason game, which is largely irrelevant at this point because most of the players who took a majority of those snaps are gone. They've been cut. We got a couple of good drives from the starters, but after that, it was mostly Kyle Trask, Devin Tompkins, guys who aren't here anymore, or if they are here, they're not really a relevant part of this team. There are a few guys worth talking about in that game who are a big part of what the Bucks want to do this year. And I want to start with Luke Goedeke. Luke Goedeke got his second NFL start. Yes, granted, preseason, but these are his first real live NFL reps against NFL caliber competition. His first start versus the Titans did not go well. He got pushed around by guys like Tier Tart. I think that's his name. He's a fringe player. He's a guy who would not make a lot of teams, definitely not as a starter, but he is for the Titans, and he pushed Goedeke around basically every time he matched up against him, which is a real concern for me because you draft a guy in the second round, you want him to be able to push around guys who aren't high-end NFL players. And yes, Luke Goedeke has a huge learning curve, and there are going to be a lot of growing pains. He's coming from a smaller school, although I contend they're better than half the SEC schools, half the Big Ten schools. They are a very good MAC team in Central Michigan University. But at the end of the day, it's still Central Michigan University. It's a big jump from LSU to the NFL, let alone Mount Pleasant, Michigan, CMU. On top of that, he's changing positions. He's going from right tackle to left guard. Now, right off the bat, it's hard to go from right to left. It's just muscle memory. You go right with every play, with every snap. You're typically going right. Now, you're not. You used to have a lot more room to work with on the outside. You've got some space to float out. You can adjust to pass rushers. You can back off and catch them a little more. Not anymore. Everything is condensed inside. Everything is faster. Everything is more physical. The competition is bigger. Defensive tackle compared to edge rushers. It is a huge transition just in the position shift, let alone the level of competition he's facing. So yeah, Goedeke got whooped versus the Titans in his first start. He looked bad. There were some positive moments, but there were way, way too many negative moments, to the point where I said, this team has to go out and sign Eric Flowers or someone, because this is not good enough. In a Super Bowl or bust year, you cannot have a gaping hole at any position, especially not one that's protecting your 45-year-old quarterback. It's just not going to cut it. Bucs did not do that. They did not go out and sign Eric Flowers or anybody. They wanted their in-house options. And they gave Goedeke a second start, which, if you're going to go with your in-house options, I think that's a smart way to go. Goedeke is the most talented of the guys you have. He is a second-round pick. He is a very good athlete. And when he makes this adjustment to the NFL and to his new position, I think he's going to be a high-end NFL player. But there is such a learning curve. It is a lot to ask for that to happen quickly. With that said, I thought he took a nice step forward in his second start versus the Colts. Now, the Titans' defensive line is bad, and there's not two ways about that. Yes, Jeffrey Simmons is a fantastic player, one of the best defensive tackles in the game, but he didn't play last week. So the guys that Goedeke got to go against were not good. They were fringe NFL players. Second string, third string kind of guys. This week, it was a full dose of reality. Grover Stewart is a good defensive tackle, an above average good defensive tackle. Definitely a guy I would want on my team. DeForest Buckner is an excellent defensive tackle. Another guy who's one of the best in the league. He's been an All-Pro. He's been a multi-time Pro Bowler. He's got length. He's got power. He's got technique. He's the full package. He is on the short list of the conversation on who is the best behind Aaron Donald. And there were times when Gedeke absolutely neutralized him. He took him out of the play. When Buckner got penetration and it looked like he might get towards the quarterback, Gedeke did a great job taking him where he wants to go, taking him around the quarterback, deterring him from getting a sack. That is exactly what you want your guys to do. Now, yes, in my perfect world, he would punch him in the chest, stonewall him, use a strong anchor, and throw him to the ground. Nobody does that. Not to a guy like Buckner. That's unrealistic for anybody. But next best thing, take him around the play, take him out of the play, use his momentum against him. That's playing smart. You can't always out-talent your opponent. When you can't, you have to be able to do something to win that rep. And I think there were times that Gedeke did a really good job doing that. That was definitely a big step forward. Very encouraging for a guy who I think will get there eventually. There were also plays where he got absolutely bullied. Grover Stewart, I think it was the second, maybe the third drive of the game, absolutely blew him up. Took his lunch money, put him on the ground, made plays in the backfield. So again, huge learning curve. You're going against Toledo football, Akron football, different position. Now you're going against two of the best defensive tackles in the league. You're going to lose reps. You're going to lose reps ugly. That's okay. You're getting experience. You're getting more developed technique every day, every week, every rep. I think he will get there in the end. Would I still go out and sign a guy like Eric Flowers? Yes, I would. I don't want Gedeke to have the pressure to where he has to be great right out of the gate. It's okay to give this guy some time. It's okay to let him acclimate, let him learn. Go get a guy like Eric Flowers for a year. If he's your fourth or fifth best offensive lineman, you've got a pretty good offensive line. And if something does happen where there is an injury, Gedeke is great depth coming off the bench, especially if he's had a chance to develop some. So I would still advocate for the Bucs going out and making that signing, getting a guy like Eric Flowers, or there are other options out there, but I think Eric Flowers is a clear fit for the system. He's a clear fit for what the Bucs want to do. I think he's really shown that he is a quality NFL guard after kind of being a bust in this league for a couple of years as a highly drafted offensive tackle. But since being transitioned to guard, he's done well. He's put together a nice little stretch of years. Another guy I might be interested in, a guy who was recently cut, and we'll talk about cuts here momentarily, Wyatt Davis. Drafted, I think, a year or two ago out of Ohio State by the Minnesota Vikings. And he's a guy who is always a weird fit in Minnesota. He's a guy who is powerful at the point of attack. He's a physical blocker. He's a power blocker. And they drafted him to be a guy who goes side to side, a guy to get to the second level, a guy who can make blocks in space. That was never Wyatt Davis's game. That was never his strength. That was never his skill set. So he was kind of a square peg in a round hole in Minnesota. And I think that's a big part of why he got cut, especially with the new coaching staff coming in, a coaching staff who does run a similar system and a lot of outside zone, coming from LA, coming from the Rams. They want guys who can move. They can make blocks in space. Kind of a guy like Luke Gedeke. Wyatt Davis wasn't that guy. Never was. The Bucs don't run that system. They run a lot of power, a lot of double team at the point of attack. And yes, you have to get to the second level because that's where big plays happen. but you have to win up front. You have to win with strength. You have to win with double teams. You have to get movement. Wyatt Davis can do that. So if the Bucks want to bring him in and maybe start him out as a depth option, but I think he's a good option possibly to compete for that starting left guard job. He's got higher level college experience. He's got more NFL experience. He's a guy who could be a really good pickup for a team like the Bucks who need interior offensive line depth. If not depth, a starter. That could realistically be Wyatt Davis. So, with that, the only other thing worth mentioning from the Colts preseason game were the injuries. We had Robert Hainsey go down and Nick Leverett go down. In that moment, it felt like really bad news, especially with the retirement of J.C. Tretter, who was the best available center on the free agent market remaining. He's gone. He's not an option anymore. He is retired. He's called it a career. So really what the Bucks have is what they have. They have Robert Hainsey as their starter, and they have Nick Leverett as their backup. And if both of those guys go down, it's a problem. And that was the case versus the Colts. Both left the game, ruled out with injuries. Luckily, neither were serious. Hainsey's back at practice. I think Leverett is already back at practice. They did MRIs, but by all accounts, those injuries were no big deal. So we got to take a collective sigh of relief. Whew, no more injuries up front. Brian Jensen was bad enough. We don't need anyone else. Please, thank you, por favor. So, those were the only things I felt were really relevant. Kyle Trask got to play. He did make the Bucks 53-man roster, which is surprising to no one after being a second-round pick. Kyle Trask may be contending for the starting job next year. I don't think that's a good thing, but that's neither here nor there because he's on the team now. So with that, I do want to dive into the Bucks' final roster and the cuts that were made because we are a few days after cut day and the waiver wire has gone through. We have our team. We have brought in our practice squad for the most part. This Bucks team is ready to go, getting ready for week 1 of the NFL season. And for the most part, this roster is what we expected it to look like. We have the top 4 wide receivers who are pretty much set in stone. Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Russell Gage, Julio Jones. There was no drama there. Those guys were all making the team. Quarterbacks, obviously all making the team. Offensive line, you knew who 4 of the 5 starters were, and we always felt pretty confident that Luke Gedeke would be that 5th guy. And he is. He's named the starter for opening day. Defense, the 6 defensive linemen you knew. The edge rushers you knew. The biggest surprise outside of one was the Bucks made a trade of a guy who I didn't think they would part ways with. I thought he'd make the final roster in Grant Stewart. Now, Grant Stewart is not a great linebacker. He's not a guy you want on the field for your defense. But he is a special teams ace. One of your best special teams players. And for a unit whose special teams coverage units did not look good and have not been good in recent years, I didn't expect them to get rid of one of their best players. But they did. They traded him to the Colts. They traded him in a 7th-round pick for a 6th-round pick in an exchange, which is good value for a guy who was essentially undrafted. That's Jason Light taking basically nothing and turning it into an asset. But he brought value to this team. And I thought he would make the team based on that special teams value. It's disappointing. It is. For a fringe roster guy, he had a very specific skill set that the Bucks need. And they need more guys like him. The special teams unit is not good. But they decided to trade him. The unit gets a little weaker. It puts a lot more pressure on a guy like Fatukasi, and I probably just butchered that name, but that is the undrafted rookie who replaced him. Undrafted out of Rutgers, played really well in the preseason. Looked like a much better on-the-field linebacker for their defensive group. He's a guy who can actually come in and give Levante David a break. He can do most everything you want your linebackers to do. Now, not at the same level as a guy like Devin White or Levante David, but for a backup linebacker, he looks like a really good depth piece. And he's going to have to be a really good special teams player because you just got rid of a really good special teams player to keep him because he's a better defender. He's your fourth linebacker. He's probably not going to see the field super often on defense. So he has to be that special teams ace that Grant Stewart was. So I think that puts a little bit more pressure on him, but he's a good player. I'm happy he's on the team. I thought Grant Stewart would also make the team. I thought they'd keep 5 linebackers. They didn't. They also kept 4 edge rushers as opposed to 5. And I thought they'd keep a 5th guy there for special teams purposes. They just went out and signed, what's his name? Garrod Avery from, I believe, Pittsburgh. And Todd Bowles spoke very highly of him. He said he'd rather go out and get that guy now than try and get him later in the season. So it felt like he was a guy that they valued, a guy that they coveted, a guy that they specifically targeted to bring in to camp. And it felt like he was going to make the roster and bring special teams value. He didn't. He was a cut casualty. He did come back on the practice squad, but he was another special teams player who I thought would be here. And then there's the big one, the one that most people are talking about, the cutting of Tyler Johnson. And I thought he was the Bucs' best receiver in preseason. He looked great. And coming into the year, he had not looked great. He looked awful. Last year, he got a lot of opportunity to play with injuries to guys like Chris Godwin. And when he got on the field, he was terrible. He stunk. I thought he had no chance to make the team coming into the year. I thought he was going to be replaced by someone undrafted. I thought him being cut was all but a formality. And then he showed all the potential, all the promise that he showed as a rookie, showed coming into the league. He's a guy who a lot of people liked in the draft, myself included. He had a skill set, and he just never lived up to it. He had one great catch against the Saints, and he drew 1 pass interference versus the Packers. Other than that, his career had been a complete wash. So I think him being cut is a reflection of how far off the radar he was coming into the year. And on the other side of the coin, Scotty Miller, who a lot of people thought would be cut, he made the team. And I think it's a reflection of how high above Tyler Johnson he was to start. Because Scotty Miller, he has shown that he can play with NFL competition. Not like the backups and the third strings and the fourth strings that Tyler Johnson was tearing up in the preseason. Scotty Miller has shown that he can be a problem for a starting NFL defense. And we saw that in the Bucs playoff game versus the Rams. Scotty Miller drew a lot of attention. They feared his speed, which is some of the most top-notch speed in the NFL. It's not Tyreek Hill level, but it's close. It's a guy like John Brown who can fly. You know, you think of some of the fastest wide receivers in the league, Scotty Miller's in that mix. So he can challenge any defense vertically, and that opens everything else up underneath. For a guy who's your 5th, 6th, 7th receiver coming off the bench, to have an elite skill set like that, that's valuable. And he's shown he can get open. He hasn't always made the catch, but when he was in the preseason playing against guys you want him to get open against, he was consistently getting open. So I think that played a big factor. Being able to get open, having proven it in the NFL versus NFL regulars versus having not in the past. So I wasn't surprised about Miller making the team over Tyler Johnson. What I was surprised about was Brashad Perriman making the team over Tyler Johnson. Perriman is a guy who is, in my opinion, the Bucs' 7th receiver. He's a fringe roster guy. And Todd Bowles was asked why Johnson was cut. And he talked about special teams and how if you're going to be a 5th or 6th receiver on this team, you have to do more than be able to catch the ball. You have to bring special teams value. That logic makes sense. I totally get that. This outcome does not. This doesn't add up. Because, and I think it was Greg Allman who put out the tweet, but I believe Brashard Perriman has 6 career special teams snaps. There is no special teams value there. And if you're talking about a guy who made the team for special teams value, that doesn't connect. So that felt unauthentic. That felt, frankly, like a lie to say he's here for a reason when he has no history of being that guy. If you were going to keep a guy for special teams value, I would cut Perriman and Johnson and keep Devin Tompkins, who is a guy who's shown return ability. He played really well as a receiver when he was on the field, and he really impressed me during the preseason. Him and Jareth Stearns both, but Tompkins has a lot more special teams value. So if you wanted that guy, you had him, and you brought him back on the practice squad. He's there. He just didn't make the team. So I wonder how safe Brashard Perriman's job will be long-term. I could see Tompkins replacing him quickly. And I really think he brings a lot more value. And I like Brashard Perriman. I think he's a good blocker. He's got great speed. He's a guy who I like having on the roster, just not for the reasons that Todd Bowles pointed to. So I think you've got your best receivers in-house. I think Perriman is a better receiver than what Tyler Johnson was, despite the better preseason from Johnson. I think Tompkins has a better preseason resume in terms of special teams and catching the ball. So you have those guys on the roster, either the 53-man or the practice squad for Tompkins. So I think the Bucs made the right move in general in letting Johnson go. But it was surprising because he had played so well. And on every release depth chart, he was listed as the 5th wide receiver behind guys like Julio Jones. He was kind of that next guy on the pecking order. So all those things made me feel like he would make the team, but seeing him not make the team is a little surprising. Yeah, it is, because he played well. But if you'd asked me a month ago, I'd tell you there was no way he was making the team. But he was actually picked up by the Houston Texans, so he will have a chance to play. I think he's going to get more opportunity in Houston. Houston is a very bad team with not good depth at any position, the receiver included. So he'll get a chance, and he could even get a chance to start there because, frankly, they're that bad. But keep in mind, even if Tyler Johnson does well in Houston, you're talking about a 5th, a 6th, a 7th wide receiver on this team. A guy who was deemed maybe the 8th wide receiver on this team, maybe the 9th wide receiver on this team. He isn't here for a reason. And even if he does well there, I think it's just a testament to how good this Bucs receiver group is. Wish him the best, but he's gone for a reason. Keep that in mind as we get ready for the regular season, getting ready to take on Dallas week 1. Other surprises, I thought the Bucs were only going to keep 3 running backs because coming into the year, Keyshawn Vaughn has been bad. He's been bad with every opportunity given. And I thought coming into all this, he would be gone. He'd be cut despite being a 3rd-round pick a couple of years ago. He was kind of that same Tyler Johnson track. No real history of being good, but he had a strong preseason. He had a strong camp. And he kind of carved out a role on this team as a 3rd ball carrier. So he won me over a little bit, and I never thought I'd say that. Keyshawn Vaughn, I was not a fan coming out of the draft, but he won me over this preseason. I thought he looked good, better than he ever has. I don't know if that's a confidence thing. I don't know if that's a physicality thing. He's acclimated, gotten bigger, stronger, faster, but I thought he looked really good. You know who hasn't looked good? Giovanni Bernard. Bernard has brought no value since signing with the Bucs last year. He has been consistently hurt. He has been a non-factor. He hasn't been able to carry the ball. He has rarely been used in the passing game, which is kind of his bread and butter. So when he was hurt again this preseason, I thought that was kind of the final nail in the coffin. Didn't bring value last year. Is looking like he's not going to bring value this year, and especially considering he's another year older. And no one lasts long in this league. Most people are not Tom Brady. especially running backs. You only get so many good years out of them, and then their body just physically breaks down because they take so much abuse. Bernard is no exception to that. He has been in this league for a long time. He's put together a good career, but at the end of the day, he's a running back in his 30s. He's 5'9". He is a smaller back, an older back. He's taken a lot of punishment, and he's not going to get healthier and more durable as he gets older. So I thought he would kind of be out the door for that reason, with Vaughn kind of stepping up and taking that role, and with Rashad White coming to town, who is a great pass catcher. So he's not going to get any carries, Bernard is. He's not going to get any opportunities to catch the ball with White in the backfield. It really felt like he had no role, especially as a guy with no special teams value. The Bucs decided to keep him, which was surprising, but he does give them good depth because when he is healthy, he has shown to be a good player. So he sneaks onto the roster despite my expectations. One guy who absolutely lived up to my expectations to make the roster was a fourth tight end, Ko Kieft. Everyone knew Cam Britt was going to make the roster. When they signed Kyle Rudolph, that felt like a really good veteran pair. And then Cade Otton was a highly regarded rookie out of Washington, a fourth-round pick. A lot of people thought it was a really good value to get him in the fourth round. And then they drafted a second rookie tight end out of Minnesota, Ko Kieft. And he was a sixth-round pick. And when you're a good team, most sixth-round picks don't make the roster. Ko Kieft, he is a man of a different breed. Because he is not Cam Britt. He is not a lot of tight ends. You think about the best tight ends in this league, guys like Travis Kelce. Ko Kieft could not be more different. He is purely a blocker, and a great one. You will not see many tight ends in this league do what he's able to do in the blocking game. He can line up at fullback. He can line up at wing. He can line up in line next to the tackle. And he's going to block the snot out of anyone he's lined up against. And he did. He's put together a highlight reel of blocks in his short NFL career. It's only been 3 games, but he is putting opponents in the dirt. And that's linebackers, that's ends. Anyone he gets a chance to block, he puts them on the ground. He finishes blocks. He was the lead block on a touchdown run. He is going to be on goal line packages. He's going to be on short down distance packages. He is an asset to this team in the blocking game. And that's what you want. You want a guy who's a depth player, a fringe roster guy, to have a role, to have something that they bring that no one else can bring. He's got a niche, and it's a very valuable one, especially for a Bucs team who looks like they want to run the ball more, who want to be more physical up front. So he is kind of a tone setter for what they want to do with a big back in Leonard Fournette, with an aging quarterback and possibly a young, inexperienced quarterback next year. Ko Kieft is a guy who can take pressure off everyone. He is all grit. He is all grime. He is all dirty work. And this is the official Ko Kieft podcast. If you are a fan of Ko Kieft, this is the podcast for you. We are leading this train here. So was really happy to see him make the roster. It was no surprise because he's played great. It was a little bit of a surprise maybe to keep 4 tight ends, but there was just no way to justify cutting any of them. Other surprises, I talked about Fatukasi, but again, he's played really, really well. The only one that caught me off guard, other than those ones, was Logan Ryan being cut. And after it kind of played out a little bit, it was really obvious why, and it was actually a really smart move by Jason Light. They had to keep Ryan Jensen on the roster so they could put him up for injury designation. He's a guy who is not going to play for a while. He's going to go on probably short-term IR, so they can try and get him back sometime later this year. But they had to keep him on the roster before they could put him on any kind of IR, which means they had to cut a player who they intended to keep. I thought it would be a fringe roster guy like Fatukasi, because I did think he'd make the roster. But I thought he'd be one of the last guys to make the roster as a 5th linebacker. Instead of putting that guy on waiver wires or putting a guy like Ko Kieft on waiver wires where some other team could snatch him, they cut Logan Ryan, who had no guaranteed money, and every intention of coming back after Jensen went on IR. And that's exactly what he did. Logan Ryan is already re-signed with the Bucs. He is back on this team, and he came with no risk of going elsewhere. He came with no dead money, and it was a really smart manipulation of this situation by Jason Light, and that's why he's one of the better GMs in the league. He does smart things that should be obvious, but so many people overlook, because it would have been so easy to justify cutting a fifth linebacker or a fourth tight end. A guy you want on the team, you intend to bring back, but you can lose those guys. You make them available, you make them vulnerable. That wasn't the case here, and it was very well played by this front office. So those were my big takeaways from the roster from cut day. The practice squad is back. That's, I think, finalized, and run through some of the names on there. Avery Gennard, who I thought would make the team. Mike Green, a defensive tackle. Wellington Prevalon. Anthony Chelsea, who I think they just picked up. Not sure where he's from, but he is on this team as a cornerback. John Molchin, who's a depth center. Devin Tompkins. Dylan Cook. Kalen Geiger. Don Gardner, Ryan Griffin, Nolan Turner, who I thought played well. J.J. Holland, J.J. Russell, and Deidre Sanat. So a couple of guys I liked, but there's just no place for him on this roster. Specifically Tompkins, who I thought had a really good camp. Howland, I thought had some good moments. Nolan Turner, I thought brings value. And J.J. Russell is a guy who is a little bit faster, a little bit more agile of a linebacker. He can do things that a guy like KJ Britt can't do. I thought he had a good camp, but again, just not good enough to beat out a really strong, a really deep roster the Bucs have in place. So with that, it is a shorter podcast. We are going to go live next week, getting ready for week 1 versus the Cowboys. Garrett will be back. Until then, you can find all our written work over at Bucs Report. You can follow me at Icewater Olson on Twitter. You can follow Garrett at NFL Ballard. And you can follow us here at the Creamsicle Chronicle at Creamsicle Crew on Twitter. So be on the lookout for our next episode coming Wednesday at 9:30. Until then, go Bucs.